Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Along a desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway on Long Island, tall marsh grass concealed a serial killer's dumping ground for over a decade. What began as a search for a missing escort in 2010 led to the discovery of multiple bodies buried in the sand and brush of Gilgo Beach. For years, the Long Island serial killer remained a phantom, taunting victims' families with phone calls while evading capture. Then in 2023, after 13 years of dead ends, investigators arrested Rex Hoyerman, an architect living just minutes from where the bodies were found. Today, we'll examine how this seemingly ordinary family man allegedly hunted vulnerable women while hiding in plain sight, and the breakthrough that finally brought the Gilgo Beach killer to justice. Stay with me as we unravel one of America's most chilling unsolved murder cases. The desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway along Gilgo Beach on Long Island seems almost purposefully designed to hide secrets. Tall, dense marsh grass sways in the Atlantic breeze, creating a natural barrier between the road and the shoreline. For years, this isolated area served as the perfect dumping ground for a killer, or possibly killers, who believed their victims would never be found. It was December 2010 when Suffolk County Police Officer John Mallier and his cadaver dog were conducting a training exercise, searching for Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old escort who had disappeared 7 months earlier after meeting a client in nearby Oak Beach. What they found instead would uncover one of the most chilling unsolved murder cases in American history. The first body was discovered on December 11th, wrapped in burlap and hidden in the thick underbrush. 3 days later, 3 more sets of remains were found in similar condition. None of them belonged to Shannon Gilbert. Instead, police had stumbled upon what would eventually be revealed as the dumping ground for at least 10 murder victims, with cases potentially spanning more than 2 decades. The initial 4 victims were identified as Maureen Brainerd Barnes, age 25, who disappeared in 2007, Melissa Barthelemy, 24, who vanished in 2009, Megan Waterman, 22, who went missing in 2010, and Amber Lynn Costello, 27, who disappeared that same year. All 4 women had worked as escorts, advertising their services on Craigslist. All had been petite, standing under 5 feet, 5 inches tall, and all had been strangled, their bodies deliberately placed along the same quarter-mile stretch of roadway. The eerie similarities between these victims quickly led investigators to conclude they were dealing with a serial killer, dubbed by media as the Long Island Serial Killer, or LISK. Some also called him the Craigslist Ripper, due to the victim's connection to the online marketplace. But the investigation was far from straightforward. As the search expanded along Ocean Parkway in spring 2011, 6 more sets of human remains were discovered. These included a female toddler, an Asian male dressed in women's clothing, and the partial remains of 2 women who would later be connected to dismembered torsos found years earlier in other parts of Long Island. The complexity of the case deepened with each discovery. Were all these victims killed by the same person? Or had this remote stretch of Barrier Island become a dumping ground for multiple killers? The varied victimology and different methods of disposal suggested the latter might be possible. The investigation into the Gilgo 4, the initial 4 women found in December 2010, revealed disturbing details about the killer's methodology. Not only had he carefully selected and disposed of his victims, but he had also contacted the families of at least one victim, Melissa Barthelemy, using her cell phone after her murder. Melissa's younger sister, Amanda, received a series of taunting calls from Melissa's phone in the weeks following her disappearance. The caller, a male, admitted to killing Melissa and described in graphic detail what he had done to her. Phone records showed these calls were made from highly populated areas in Manhattan, including Madison Square Garden and Times Square, locations teeming with people and surveillance cameras, yet the killer managed to remain undetected. These calls demonstrated not just cruelty, but a calculated intelligence. The killer kept each call under 3 minutes, presumably knowing that longer calls might be more easily traced. He seemed to understand police procedures and how to evade them. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was predation by someone who enjoyed the process of hunting, killing, and then tormenting the families of his victims. The investigation faced numerous challenges from the start. The remote location of the bodies meant there were no witnesses. The victims' work as escorts complicated matters further, as many had been reported missing days or even weeks after they were last seen. And the jurisdictional complexities of a case spanning multiple counties in New York created bureaucratic hurdles that slowed progress. Then there was the question of Shannan Gilbert, whose disappearance had inadvertently led to the discovery of the other victims. Her remains were finally found in December 2011, about a mile from where the Gilgo 4 had been discovered. She was located in a marshy area near Oak Beach, the community where she had last been seen alive. But unlike the other victims, Shannan's death presented a puzzle. The medical examiner ruled her cause of death as undetermined, and some investigators suggested she may have drowned accidentally while fleeing in a drug-induced panic. Her family vehemently rejected this theory, insisting she had been murdered like the others. The night of Shannan's disappearance, May 1, 2010, added another layer of intrigue to the case. At around 4:45 a.m., she made a frantic 23-minute call to 911, claiming someone was trying to kill her. She then knocked on the doors of several Oak Beach residents, appearing disoriented and terrified. One of those residents was Dr. Peter Hackett, who called Shannan's mother, Mari Gilbert, the next day claiming he had taken Shannan in, given her medication, and then let her leave with a driver. He later denied making this call, though phone records confirmed it had occurred. The circumstances surrounding Shannan's final hours have led many to question whether her death is connected to the other Gilgo Beach victims or represents a separate case entirely. The Gilbert family's attorney, John Ray, has suggested that Shannan may have witnessed something in the gated Oak Beach community that led to her death, potentially connecting some of its residents to the other murders. The investigation seemed to stall for years after the initial discoveries. Suffolk County Police faced criticism for their handling of the case, particularly for their apparent lack of urgency in investigating the disappearances of sex workers. The department's former chief, James Burke, was later imprisoned on unrelated charges of civil rights violations and obstruction of justice, but questions remained about whether his leadership had impeded the Gilgo investigation. In January 2020, Suffolk County Police released a previously withheld piece of evidence, a photograph of a black leather belt embossed with the letters HM or WH, depending on how it's viewed. They believed this belt belonged to the killer and had been used in at least one of the murders. This release, along with the launch of a dedicated website for tips about the case, signaled a renewed commitment to solving these long-cold murders. Then came a significant breakthrough. On July 13, 2023, police arrested Rex Hoyerman, a 59-year-old architect who lived in Massapequa Park, Long Island, and worked in Manhattan. Hoyerman was charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo 4, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. He was also named as the prime suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, though charges were pending as the investigation continued. The evidence against Hoyerman was substantial and had been building for years. A witness description from Amber Lynn Costello's last client matched Hoyerman's physical appearance. Cell phone data placed him in the vicinity of locations where victims' phones had last pinged. And most damning of all, DNA recovered from a pizza crust Hoyerman discarded matched male DNA found on the burlap used to wrap Megan Waterman's body. Hoyerman had lived for decades in the same Massapequa Park house, just a 20-minute drive from Gilgo Beach. He was married with 2 children and had operated his architecture firm since 1994. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, a large man who kept to himself. Few suspected that this seemingly ordinary professional might be responsible for one of New York's most notorious killing sprees. The arrest of Hoyerman brought a measure of relief to the victims' families and the Long Island community, but it also raised new questions. Was Hoyerman responsible for all the Gilgo Beach victims, or only the Gilgo 4? What about the other remains found along Ocean Parkway, including the toddler and the Asian male? And what, if any, connection did Shannon Gilbert's case have to these murders? As investigators continued to build their case against Hoyerman, they conducted extensive searches of his home, his office in Manhattan, and a storage unit he maintained. These searches yielded hundreds of electronic devices and a cache of between 200 and 300 firearms, many illegally owned. Reports suggested that investigators also found a collection of disturbing bondage pornography and other materials that might connect him to the crimes. The details of Hoyerman's alleged crimes paint a picture of calculated brutality. According to court documents, he would contact his victims through their escort advertisements, communicate with them using burner phones, and meet them while his wife and children were out of town. The murders appeared to follow a pattern: strangulation, wrapping in burlap, and disposal along the same stretch of Ocean Parkway. The taunting phone calls to Melissa Barthelomew's sister revealed not just sadism, but a desire to extend the suffering beyond the initial act of murder. In one call, the killer asked Amanda if she knew what had happened to her sister. When she said no, he replied, "I killed her," and then described sexual acts he claimed to have performed on Melissa's corpse. These calls were made from highly trafficked areas in New York City, including near Melissa's apartment in the Bronx and around Times Square. The caller seemed to understand that these locations would make it difficult for police to isolate him on surveillance footage or track his movements. This suggested someone familiar with law enforcement techniques, perhaps explaining why the case remained unsolved for so long. The investigation into Hoyerman also revealed disturbing online behavior. Using his personal email address, he had allegedly conducted numerous searches for information about the Gilgo Beach investigation, the victims, and their families. He also reportedly searched for sadistic pornography and information about how to avoid detection for his crimes. What makes the Gilgo Beach case particularly haunting is the long period over which these murders may have occurred. While the Gilgo 4 were killed between 2007 and 2010, some of the other remains found along Ocean Parkway date back much further. Jessica Taylor, whose partial remains were found during the 2011 search, had been missing since 2003. The remains of another victim, Valerie Mack, had been unidentified for 2 decades until genetic genealogy helped name her in 2020. The case of the unidentified Asian male, believed to have been between 17 and 23 years old at the time of his death, adds another layer of complexity. Found wearing women's clothing, his manner of death and disposal differed from the female victims, suggesting he might have been killed by someone else. Similarly, the female toddler found wrapped in a blanket, later determined to be related to one of the other unidentified victims, presents a different victimology than the Gilgo 4. The geographical spread of related cases compounds the mystery. In 1997, the dismembered torso of an unidentified woman was found in Hempstead Lake State Park. In 2011, during the expanded search along Ocean Parkway, partial remains were discovered that matched this torso. The victim, still known only as Peaches due to a tattoo on her body, is believed to be the mother of the toddler found near Gilgo Beach. These earlier cases suggest the possibility that the Gilgo Beach dumping ground may have been in use for much longer than initially thought, or that multiple killers might have used the same area over time. The remote location, with its dense vegetation and limited access points, made it an ideal spot to dispose of bodies with minimal risk of discovery. The arrest of Hoyerman may have solved the murders of the Gilgo Four, but it leaves open the question of whether he was responsible for any of the other victims. Investigators have been careful to state that the investigation remains active and ongoing, suggesting they haven't ruled out the possibility of additional perpetrators or additional victims beyond those currently attributed to Hoyerman. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Murray Gilbert, Shannon's mother, had become a vocal advocate for the victims, pushing police to take the cases seriously and maintain the investigation. Tragically, she didn't live to see Hoyerman's arrest. In 2016, she was murdered by her other daughter, Sarah, who suffered from schizophrenia. Murray's advocacy, however, had helped keep the case in the public eye and may have contributed to the eventual breakthrough. The other families have expressed gratitude for the arrest, while acknowledging that it reopens wounds that never fully healed. Melissa Barthelomy's mother, Lynn, described feeling physically ill when she learned of Hoyerman's arrest, the news bringing back the full force of her loss. For these families, justice delayed has meant decades of uncertainty and pain. The Gilgo Beach case highlights troubling aspects of how missing persons cases are handled when the victims come from marginalized communities. Many of the victims were sex workers, and their disappearances didn't initially generate the level of police attention or media coverage that might have come with victims from different backgrounds. Some families reported feeling dismissed by authorities when they first reported their loved ones missing. This disparity in treatment has been termed the missing white woman syndrome by some criminologists and media critics, referring to the disproportionate attention given to cases involving young, attractive white women from middle-class backgrounds compared to missing persons from other demographic groups. While all of the Gilgo Four were white, their work in the sex industry appears to have affected how seriously their disappearances were initially taken. The case also illustrates the vulnerability of sex workers to predatory violence. The killer specifically targeted escorts, knowing they often meet clients alone in isolated locations and might not be immediately reported missing. The advent of online advertising platforms like Craigslist made it easier for predators to identify potential victims while maintaining anonymity. As the case against Rex Hoyerman proceeds through the legal system, investigators continue to examine potential connections to other unsolved murders across Long Island and beyond. Some have suggested possible links to the Manorville butcher cases, where several dismembered bodies were found in the woods of Manorville, New York, between 2000 and 2003. Partial remains of two of these victims were later found during the Gilgo Beach search. The arrest of Hoyerman came after a task force was formed in 2022 to re-examine the evidence in the Gilgo Beach cases. This task force included the FBI, state police, and local law enforcement from Suffolk and Nassau counties. Their fresh look at the evidence, combined with advances in DNA technology and cell phone data analysis, finally led to the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for over a decade. One key piece of evidence came from a witness who had seen Amber Lynn Costello on the night she disappeared. This witness described her client as a large, awkward man driving a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck. Investigators were able to identify Hoyerman as the owner of such a vehicle during the relevant time period. This, combined with the DNA evidence and cell phone data, created a compelling case against him. The DNA evidence itself represented a triumph of modern forensic techniques. Male DNA had been recovered from the burlap used to wrap Megan Waterman's body, but it wasn't sufficient for a traditional DNA profile. Instead, investigators used a technique called mitochondrial DNA analysis, which examines DNA passed down through maternal lineage. This allowed them to establish a familial connection to Hoyerman, which was then confirmed through a direct DNA sample obtained from the discarded pizza crust. As investigators build their case against Hoyerman, they continue to examine whether he might be connected to other unsolved murders. His work as an architect required him to travel, and authorities are looking into whether any unsolved cases in areas he visited might bear similarities to the Gilgo Beach murders. They're also examining cold cases from the 1990s, when Hoyerman was establishing his architecture practice and living on Long Island. The Gilgo Beach case has captivated public interest, not just because of its gruesome nature, but because it remained unsolved for so long despite substantial evidence. It has spawned numerous documentaries, podcasts, and books, each attempting to make sense of the complex web of victims, locations, and potential suspects. The 2020 Netflix film Lost Girls dramatized Mary Gilbert's fight for justice for her daughter Shannon, highlighting the struggles families face when trying to keep attention on missing loved ones from marginalized communities. For the residents of Long Island, particularly those living near Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach, the case has cast a long shadow. The idea that a killer had been using their community as a dumping ground for years, possibly decades, created a sense of unease that persisted long after the initial discoveries. The arrest of Hoyerman, a man who had lived and worked among them for years without raising suspicion, has only deepened that discomfort. The revelation that Rex Hoyerman, a seemingly ordinary architect with a family and established business, could allegedly be responsible for such horrific crimes has forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about how well we really know our neighbors. Hoyerman lived in the same Massapequa Park house for decades, commuted to his Manhattan office, and maintained what appeared to be a normal life while allegedly harboring unimaginable secrets. Following Hoyerman's arrest, investigators spent weeks meticulously searching his home on First Avenue in Massapequa Park. The modest red single-story house became the center of intense police activity as forensic teams in white protective suits carried out box after box of potential evidence. Neighbors described the scene as surreal. Television news helicopters hovering overhead, police tents erected in the yard, and a constant stream of investigators moving in and out of a property they had passed by countless times without a second thought. The search of Hoyerman's home yielded disturbing findings. According to court documents and law enforcement sources, investigators discovered a collection of bondage and torture pornography, along with a trove of material related to serial killers, including books and digital files about infamous murderers. They also found what has been described as a vault containing between 200 and 300 firearms, many of them unregistered and therefore illegal under New York law. Perhaps most chillingly, investigators reportedly found electronic devices containing searches related to the Gilgo Beach investigation itself, suggesting Hoyerman had been following news about his own alleged crimes. He had allegedly searched for updates on the case, information about the victims, and details about their families. This behavior, known as offender monitoring, is not uncommon among serial killers who derive satisfaction from staying connected to their crimes and the subsequent investigations. The search extended beyond Hoyerman's home to his office in Midtown Manhattan and a storage unit he maintained. From these locations, investigators seized additional electronic devices, files, and other potential evidence. The volume of material was so extensive that prosecutors acknowledged it would take months to process everything fully. As investigators built their case against Hoyerman, they revealed the painstaking process that had led them to him. The breakthrough came in early 2022 when a New York State investigator noticed a connection between Hoyerman and a Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck mentioned by a witness who had seen Amber Lynn Costello on the night of her disappearance. This witness, who had been at Costello's house when she left to meet a client, described seeing a large, awkward man driving such a vehicle. Records showed that Hoyerman had owned a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche during the relevant time period, 2007 to 2010, when the Gilgo Four were killed. This connection prompted investigators to take a closer look at Hoyerman, eventually leading to the DNA sample that would link him directly to at least one of the murders. The DNA evidence came from a particularly disturbing aspect of the crimes. The killer had not only murdered his victims, but had taken measures to degrade them even in death. Megan Waterman's body showed signs of being bound with tape and displayed evidence of sexual activity after death. Male DNA was recovered from the burlap used to wrap her remains, but it wasn't sufficient for a complete DNA profile. Instead, investigators used mitochondrial DNA analysis, which examines genetic material passed down through maternal lineage. This provided enough information to suggest a possible match to Hoyerman. To confirm this, investigators needed a direct DNA sample, which they obtained by collecting a pizza crust that Hoyerman discarded outside his office in Manhattan. This sample provided the definitive match that led to his arrest. Cell phone evidence also played a crucial role in connecting Hoyerman to the crimes. Investigators found that he had used burner phones to contact the victims, carefully using these disposable devices to arrange meetings while avoiding creating a digital trail that could be traced back to him. However, analysis of cell tower data showed that these burner phones often pinged towers near his home or office around the times they were used to contact victims. Moreover, the taunting calls made to Melissa Barthelomy's sister after her murder were found to have been made from locations near where Hoyerman was known to be at those times. In one particularly incriminating instance, a call was made from near his Manhattan office during business hours. The details of how Hoyerman allegedly selected and approached his victims reveal a calculated methodology. According to prosecutors, he would search escort advertisements on platforms like Craigslist, looking for petite women who worked alone. He would contact them using burner phones, arrange meetings, and allegedly commit the murders when his wife and children were out of town. This pattern suggests someone who compartmentalized his life, maintaining a facade of normalcy while methodically planning and executing his crimes. The victimology of the Gilgo Four shows clear preferences. All were petite women in their 20s who worked as escorts. This specific targeting is consistent with many serial killers, who often select victims based on particular characteristics or vulnerabilities. In this case, the victims' work as escorts made them both accessible to the killer and less likely to be immediately reported missing. While Hoyerman has been charged with 3 of the Gilgo Four murders and named as the prime suspect in the 4th, questions remain about whether he might be connected to any of the other remains found along Ocean Parkway. The varied nature of these other victims, including the Asian male, the toddler, and victims whose remains were dismembered, suggests potentially different perpetrators with different methods and motivations. The case of Jessica Taylor illustrates this complexity. Her partial remains were found during the expanded search along Ocean Parkway in 2011, but they matched a torso discovered in Manorville, New York in 2003, 4 years before the first of the Gilgo Four disappeared. The dismemberment of her body and the separation of her remains across 2 locations represents a different modus operandi than the Gilgo Four murders, where victims were strangled and their intact bodies wrapped in burlap. Similarly, the remains of Valerie Mack followed this pattern. Her torso was found in Manorville in 2000, with her skull and limbs discovered along Ocean Parkway in 2011. This suggests a killer who was active earlier than the time frame of the Gilgo Four murders and who took additional steps to complicate identification of the victims. The case of the unidentified Asian male presents an even more distinct profile. Believed to have been between 17 and 23 years old at the time of death, he was found wearing women's clothing, suggesting a possible hate crime targeting someone from the LGBTQ+ community. This differs significantly from the pattern seen with the female victims and may represent an entirely separate case that happened to share the same dumping ground. The female toddler found wrapped in a blanket near Gilgo Beach adds another layer to the mystery. DNA testing determined she was related to another unidentified victim nicknamed Peaches due to a tattoo on her torso, which was found in Hempstead Lake State Park in 1997. The relationship between these victims, believed to be mother and daughter, suggests a different type of crime, possibly domestic in nature, rather than the predatory pattern seen with the Gilgo Four. These variations in victimology and methodology have led many investigators to believe that the Gilgo Beach area may have been used as a dumping ground by multiple killers over time. The remote location, with limited access points and dense vegetation, would have appealed to anyone looking to dispose of remains without detection. The fact that these bodies remained undiscovered for years, despite being relatively close to a public roadway, demonstrates how effective this location was for concealing evidence. The question of whether Shannan Gilbert's death is connected to the other Gilgo Beach victims remains contentious. Unlike the Gilgo Four, Shannan wasn't found wrapped in burlap or deliberately hidden. Her remains were discovered in a marshy area near Oak Beach, about a mile from where the other victims had been found. The medical examiner ruled her cause of death as undetermined, and some investigators have suggested she may have drowned accidentally while fleeing in a disoriented state. However, an independent autopsy commissioned by the Gilbert family found evidence of potential strangulation, with the hyoid bone in her neck showing signs of damage. The family's attorney, John Ray, has maintained that Shannan was murdered and has pointed to suspicious circumstances surrounding her disappearance, particularly involving residents of the gated Oak Beach community. The most notable of these is Dr. Peter Hackett, who called Shannan's mother the day after her disappearance, claiming he had taken her in and given her medication before she left with a driver. He later denied making this call, though phone records confirmed it had occurred. This inconsistency, along with other aspects of Hackett's behavior, has led some to view him with suspicion, though he has never been charged in connection with Shannan's death. The 23-minute 911 call that Shannan made on the night of her disappearance adds another layer of mystery. During this call, she repeatedly stated that someone was trying to kill her, though she didn't identify who. She then knocked on the doors of several Oak Beach residents, appearing terrified and disoriented. The last of these residents, Gus Coletti, saw her flee when a vehicle, believed to be her driver's, approached. This was the last confirmed sighting of Shannan alive. The Suffolk County Police Department initially refused to release the recording of this 911 call, despite repeated requests from the Gilbert family. It was only after years of legal battles that a judge ordered the release of the call in 2022, though by that time, portions of it had already been leaked to the media. The full recording has provided some insight into Shannan's final hours, but has not definitively resolved the question of whether her death was connected to the other Gilgo Beach victims. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman has not directly addressed Shannan's case, and investigators have not publicly linked him to her death. This suggests they may view her case as separate from the Gilgo Four murders, though the investigation remains ongoing. The Gilgo Beach case has exposed troubling aspects of how law enforcement handles cases involving victims from marginalized communities. Many of the victims' families reported feeling dismissed when they first reported their loved ones missing. Melissa Barthelomy's mother, Lynn, has described being told by a police officer that, "Your daughter's an escort. She'll come back." This dismissive attitude delayed the start of serious investigations into these disappearances, potentially allowing the killer to continue operating undetected. Mari Gilbert, Shannan's mother, became a vocal advocate for all the victims, pushing authorities to take the cases seriously and maintain the investigation, even when it appeared to stall. Her advocacy was portrayed in the 2020 Netflix film Lost Girls, which highlighted the struggles families face when trying to keep attention on missing loved ones from stigmatized backgrounds. Tragically, Mari Gilbert didn't live to see the arrest of a suspect in the Gilgo Beach case. In July 2016, she was murdered by her daughter Sarah, who suffered from schizophrenia. Mari's death added another layer of tragedy to a case already marked by immense suffering, but her advocacy had helped keep the case in the public eye and may have contributed to the eventual breakthrough. The investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders also faced internal challenges within the Suffolk County Police Department. Former Police Chief James Burke, who led the department from 2012 to 2015, was later imprisoned on unrelated charges of civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. During his tenure, he reportedly blocked FBI involvement in the Gilgo Beach investigation, a decision that many critics believe hampered progress on the case. Burke's own criminal behavior, he was convicted of beating a handcuffed suspect who had stolen items from his police vehicle and then orchestrating a departmental cover-up, raised questions about his leadership and judgment. Some have speculated that his resistance to FBI involvement may have been motivated by a desire to avoid federal scrutiny of his department, rather than what was best for the investigation. It wasn't until after Burke's departure that the Suffolk County Police Department fully embraced collaboration with federal authorities on the Gilgo Beach case. The task force formed in 2022, which included the FBI, state police, and local law enforcement from Suffolk and Nassau counties, was able to make the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for over a decade. This collaboration brought fresh perspectives and additional resources to the investigation. The FBI contributed advanced forensic techniques and access to national databases that helped connect the dots between evidence that had been collected years earlier. The result was the identification of Rex Heuermann as a suspect and his subsequent arrest in July 2023. As the case against Heuermann proceeds through the legal system, investigators continue to examine whether he might be connected to other unsolved murders. His work as an architect required him to travel, and authorities are looking into whether any unsolved cases in areas he visited might bear similarities to the Gilgo Beach murders. They're also examining cold cases from the 1990s, when Heuermann was establishing his architecture practice and living on Long Island. The search of Heuermann's electronic devices has reportedly yielded evidence of his interest in the Gilgo Beach case itself, as well as material related to other serial killers. This suggests a fascination with serial murder that extends beyond his alleged crimes. Such interests are not uncommon among serial killers, who often study previous cases to learn techniques for evading detection or to derive vicarious satisfaction from the crimes of others. The psychological profile that emerges from what is known about the Gilgo Beach killer, whether or not Heuermann is ultimately convicted, is that of a highly organized, methodical predator. The careful selection of victims, use of burner phones, disposal of bodies in a remote location, and taunting calls to a victim's family all suggest someone who derived satisfaction not just from killing, but from the entire process of hunting, killing, and then extending the suffering to the victims' families. This level of organization and planning is consistent with what criminologists call an organized killer, someone who carefully plans their crimes, takes precautions to avoid detection, and may maintain a facade of normalcy in their everyday life. Such killers are often intelligent and socially functional, able to blend into their communities without raising suspicion. The fact that Heuermann allegedly maintained a successful architecture practice and family life for decades while potentially committing these murders fits this profile. The taunting phone calls to Melissa Barthelemy's sister reveal a particularly disturbing aspect of the killer's psychology. These calls weren't necessary for the commission of the crimes. They represented an additional risk of detection. but they provided the killer with an opportunity to extend his control and inflict further suffering. The sexual nature of some of these calls, in which the killer described acts he claimed to have performed on Melissa's body, suggests a sadistic satisfaction in the family's distress. For the families of the victims, the arrest of a suspect has brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Lynn Barthélemy, Melissa's mother, described feeling physically ill when she learned of Hoyerman's arrest, the news bringing back the full force of her loss. Lorraine Ealer, Megan Waterman's mother, expressed gratitude to the investigators who had continued working on the case, but acknowledged that nothing could bring her daughter back. The sister of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the first of the Gilgo Four to disappear, spoke of the difficulty of knowing that someone had been walking free for years after taking her sister's life. For these families, justice delayed has meant decades of uncertainty and pain. The legal process ahead will force them to relive the details of their loved ones' deaths, a necessary but painful step toward closure. The impact of the Gilgo Beach case extends beyond the immediate families of the victims. It has raised awareness about the vulnerability of sex workers to predatory violence and the need for law enforcement to take all missing persons cases seriously, regardless of the victim's background or occupation. Advocacy groups have pointed to the case as an example of how societal stigma against sex workers can impede investigations and delay justice. The case has also highlighted advances in forensic technology that have made it possible to solve cold cases that might have remained unsolved in previous decades. The use of mitochondrial DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, and sophisticated cell phone data analysis has transformed how investigators approach complex cases with limited physical evidence. These techniques have led to breakthroughs in numerous cold cases across the country, bringing resolution to families who had given up hope of ever finding answers. For the residents of Long Island, particularly those living near Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach, the case has forced a reckoning with the idea that a killer had been using their community as a dumping ground for years, possibly decades. The arrest of Hoyerman, a man who had lived and worked among them for years without raising suspicion, has only deepened that discomfort. The Gilgo Beach case has captivated public interest not just because of its gruesome nature, but because it remained unsolved for so long despite substantial evidence. It has spawned numerous documentaries, podcasts, and books, each attempting to make sense of the complex web of victims, locations, and potential suspects. The case represents a dark chapter in Long Island's history, one that continues to unfold as the investigation and legal proceedings against Hoyerman progress. As of early 2024, Rex Hoyerman remains in custody, awaiting trial for the murders of Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges. Prosecutors have indicated they plan to charge him with the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes as well, once they have completed their analysis of additional evidence. The investigation into the other remains found along Ocean Parkway continues, with authorities working to determine whether these cases are connected to Hoyerman or represent the work of different killers. The identification of Peaches and her daughter, as well as the Asian male victim, remains a priority, as providing names to these victims is a crucial step toward justice. For now, the desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway along Gilgo Beach remains a place of somber reflection, a reminder of lives cut short and the long, winding path toward justice. The tall marsh grass still sways in the Atlantic breeze, but the secrets it once held are slowly being revealed, bringing light to a darkness that has haunted Long Island for far too long. The Gilgo Beach case stands as a testament to the persistence of investigators who refuse to let these victims be forgotten, the advocacy of families who demanded justice for their loved ones, and the advances in forensic science that finally made it possible to identify a suspect after more than a decade. While many questions remain unanswered, the arrest of Rex Heuermann represents a significant step toward closure in one of America's most chilling unsolved murder cases. As the legal process unfolds, the families of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello may finally see justice for their loved ones. For the other victims found along Ocean Parkway, the search for answers continues, a reminder that behind every set of remains is a human being with a name, a story, and people who loved them and deserve to know the truth about what happened. The marshy coastline of Gilgo Beach may have been chosen as a dumping ground because it seemed like a place where secrets could stay hidden forever. But as this case has shown, even the most carefully concealed crimes eventually come to light. The truth, like the tide, cannot be held back indefinitely.